It is with great pleasure that I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar on international development and the new terrain of blended finance. Our webinar coordinator, Marcus Corbold, has done an extraordinary job, and I am delighted to advise that we have registrants from 18 different countries, which speaks volumes about the interest in this topic and, of course, Marcus's abilities to get the word out. My name is Jean Lowry, and I have the honor of being the president of the Canadian Association of International Development Professionals, which we normally call CAIDP. CAIDP is an organization that is managed and operated by volunteers representing a diverse spectrum of the international development community in Canada. Our members work around the world, providing expertise and services to a vast range of donors and clients. We are recognized by Global Affairs Canada as an important catalyst in the development community. Members of CAIDP receive many benefits, including discounts on DevEx, development aid, professional events, and insurance. We have a job posting service, access to the OECD library, and many other benefits, which you can access by clicking on the link on the slides. CAIDP also hosts a hub with over 1,200 members where we share development opportunities and job listings. Along with these benefits is the critical role we play in providing networking opportunities for our members. We will be having our annual conference in Ottawa on October 7th and 8th, and I would like to invite you to attend and be part of an ongoing dialogue on critical development issues such as blended finance. If you sign up for the conference before August 16th, you can also take advantage of our early bird special. We also offer a discount on a membership and conference package. CAIDP is a community of like-minded development professionals who are striving for a better future. If you would like to be a part of that community, please join us as a member. On that note, I would like to introduce Jerry Quigley, whom I had the pleasure of meeting quite recently. Jerry's work in international development and in development finance is, however, widely known, and he is a respected and talented leader in this sector. It is with great pleasure that I turn this webinar over to Jerry to introduce our guests. Thank you.
Very much appreciate that introduction, and Mita's been a member of CAIDP for some time, and we've always appreciated the hard work that that CAIDP does. Just a big welcome to all of the different people. I recognize some of the names on there, and those I don't, welcome to you as well, of course. Mita is an NGO with a long history of both successes and sometimes, and actually more importantly, failures in the area of impact investing. As I think about blended finance, innovative finance, or whatever term we wish to call that at this particular time or in this event, I sense that it's a little bit like the early stages in a process of maturation that microfinance found itself back in the 80s and 90s. It will inevitably go through a period of introduction, innovation, research, evaluation, more implementation, errors, improvement, defining terms, more and more implementation again, and more errors and improvement. And eventually what will rise out of that over the next 5 to 10 years will be a tool within international development that can serve the industry for really what we're all seeking, which is impact on poverty and alleviation of poverty. Each presenter will have about 10 minutes, and then we will have questions after each presenter, rather than saving up those questions for the end. If we have time at the end, we'll return to questions for anybody that has them. Final note, the webinar will be recorded and available for CAIDP members on the CAIDP website. And without further ado, then I'm going to introduce our first presenter. I'm not going to read the biographic information for each presenter because I want to leave as much time as possible for them to present and then for you to ask questions. But it's a great panel. It's an experienced and knowledgeable group of experts from some of the most influential organizations in this space. And the first presenter we have is Justice Johnson, Senior Associate at Convergence. And I think everybody knows Convergence, but Justice will introduce that organization. I'll be back after Justice's presentation to introduce our next panelist. So over to you, Justice.
Thanks very much, Jerry, and to CAIDP as well for organizing. Jerry, I wholeheartedly agree with your opening remarks there. I think that really sets us up well for this conversation. So my name is Justice. I'm from Convergence. Convergence is the global network for blended finance. We're generating blended finance data, intelligence, and deal flow to increase private sector investment in developing countries. So really, essentially, we're a global membership as well of public, private, and philanthropic organizations that are all aligned around the need for more private sector capital to flow to developing countries aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're supporting our members through a variety of activities to really build better blended finance practices. So today I'm going to cover quickly a little bit about what, why, and how blended finance. So what is blended finance? Blended finance is the use of catalytic capital from public or philanthropic sources that increase private sector investment in developing countries for the Sustainable Development Goals or for development impact. So the tricky thing about kind of conceptualizing blended finance is it's not really a thing per se. It's really an approach to structuring the financing for any development project or series of development projects that are well suited. So blended finance can be used across a diverse set of development activities, from renewable energy to health insurance, water and sanitation projects, to education infrastructure, for example. So it's really not one specific intervention or an investment approach, but it's kind of this broader concept of structuring the project such that different types of capital can invest alongside each other. So we like to think about blended finance as kind of having three core characteristics. So first and foremost, blended finance is about creating impact towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or creating progress towards that really extensive list of 169 targets that we've agreed upon to meet by 2030. So each project at the core is an impact-oriented project, although not every investor or capital provider in that transaction needs to have a development motive. The second core characteristic are returns. So that is, not every single type of development project is well suited to blended finance. Blended finance is best suited to projects where there is some type of commercial revenues with which to repay investors. And finally, leverage. So the idea is that without the public or philanthropic capital being used in this strategic way, the private sector investment would not have happened into that specific project, sector, or country. So the idea is to bring in new capital really here. So now I'll turn it over to the audience here to answer this quick poll. What is the estimated annual financing gap for the Sustainable Development Goals? So I'm transitioning to the why here. Great, so here are the results, and this mirrors, I suppose, the opening poll that folks took about how familiar you are with blended finance. Looks like fairly similar distribution across here, but the correct answer is the 2.5 trillion needed in addition to what we're current spending. So that's the financing gap. So this is some brilliant economists from the United Nations got together after we agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals and tried to do some back of the envelope math on the additional investment that would be required to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And this really goes to the core of the rationale, or the why. So blended finance, it is not new. In many ways, many organizations have been working with the private sector and have been blending their concessional or catalytic capital with private sector capital for many decades. But there's been kind of a increased focus on blended finance as just one of the solutions that will help us start to think about that from the billions to trillions agenda, or how to start thinking about one of the tools that can be used to crowd in more financing for the Sustainable Development Goals, in addition to things like thinking about tax revenues, thinking about remittances. So just one of the additional sources. And the second is really that there are really ripe opportunities for the private sector in the Sustainable Development Goals. There have been many studies, and there really is increased appetite amongst the private sector for investment into the Sustainable Development Goals. And then the third point is really that these projects and this capital needs to be complementary to what's already happening in the market and additional. So that's really that leverage component. But this is bringing in new dollars that would not otherwise be used for the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a little bit of a dense slide here, but the point is that catalytic capital, that concessional capital from public and philanthropic organizations can come in a lot of different forms. And there's a lot of different ways for organizations to participate in blended finance. Convergence, we map kind of 4 broad typical blended finance archetypes here. So concessional debt or equity. This can also be an investment stage grant, but essentially the idea that catalytic capital would take on increased risk in the project without getting a risk-adjusted return. And the idea there is that that creates greater risk cushion for the commercial investors and might even bolster their returns. So that capital is being used for projects that might have traditionally been funded by grants alone, and now we're able to blend grants and debt or equity capital from commercial investors. There are also guarantees, early stage capital that's provided to design projects. We see this a lot in the infrastructure sector, as well as technical assistance funds. So the idea of capacity building or some sort of ESG integration funding alongside commercial investment to ensure the project has high standards and high impact. So Convergence, we're seeking to essentially capture data on blended finance because we recognize that it's not new. And also, if you're catching my drift here, it comes in a lot of shapes and sizes. And so we're trying to aggregate information from primarily publicly available sources to see how different blended finance structures have been deployed in certain sectors or regions. So to date, we estimate that there are well over 450 blended finance transactions that have taken place that have resulted in $130 billion in total capital flows to developing countries, and that we see a really broad and diverse set of investors or capital providers, and this includes public, philanthropic, and private organizations. As we can expect, certain organizations are much more active, so certain development agencies and private foundations are repeat investors, and then others are local investors or NGOs that have structured really specific transactions that meet the specific criteria of their development project. All right, so one last poll question. To which of the Sustainable Development Goals do you think blended finance is best aligned or best suited to address? Great. So we have the majority of folks that have responded to all of the above, as well as a decent number behind Goal 8, decent work and economic growth. I guess this depends a little bit on the interpretation. If we bring up these slides here, I think both are correct. I would say of the goals that I listed there, we'll see that Goal 8 is the highest in terms of the alignment of Convergence's tracking of alignment to the Sustainable Development Goals of what projects we've already seen in the market. So we can see here goals that have been highly aligned to date. Include Goal 9, industry, infrastructure, and innovation. We see a lot of blended finance happening in the infrastructure sector. Goal 8, but really there is kind of different levels of alignment. So what we're seeing here is the percentage or proportion of the projects that we looked at their alignment to different Sustainable Development Goals. And I just want to kind of highlight 2 points here. One is that blended finance is not a panacea, so it will not alone fill that billions to trillions gap, and it won't be suited for every single development projects. There are still definitely opportunities for traditional approaches and other innovative approaches as well, results-based financing, for example, but also that blended finance is a flexible tool, and even for those Sustainable Development Goals that are relatively less aligned, there may be opportunities to deploy blended finance. So even in, for example, Goal 16, seen peace, justice, and institutions. We've seen some interesting, an interesting blended finance transaction around financing for news and media coverage to help with fair elections. So there are unique opportunities in a lot of these different goals or a lot of development areas for blended finance. Questions, so feel free to type your question into the question box. I see one question that's come through on the chat. I'm not sure who it is from, but who is likely to become blended finance providers? Do you think commercial banks will play some role in this field given the financial regulations and Basel III? This is a great question. Commercial banks are the most active type of private sector investor that we see in blended finance. So on Convergence's website, you can see some of the analysis that we're doing in terms of what types of private investors are being crowded into the space, different asset managers, pension funds, insurance companies, but I would say the most active has been commercial banks. This includes a number of international diversified financial institutions, but also a number of local banks that are able to get involved in projects if there's a little bit more risk coverage. There certainly are some implications of Basel III, and this is an important consideration, but there are a lot of commercial banks that are already active in these sectors and countries, and so thinking about how to structure projects to bring them a little bit further downstream to more bottom of the pyramid clients or smaller projects, more rural projects, that type of thing. So that's a great question. I see one public question for me here. What are some principal constraints of blended finance? I think is the question there. Certainly, there are a number of constraints or considerations, I suppose. I mean, first and foremost, blended finance is not a panacea, as I said. So a lot of it is determining if blended finance is the right approach, and the very basic limitation there is whether or not a project will have revenues such that they can repay investors. So that's kind of the first litmus test. But I would say, I'm not sure if this would count as a constraint, but considerations, you know, there are important considerations of how public capital is used concessionally to crowd in commercial capital such that it isn't an undue subsidy or we aren't kind of mismanaging public funds. So there is a really important question around ensuring that minimum concessionality is used, that there is financial additionality so that this capital wouldn't have invested in the project without these this catalytic capital, and also impact measurement and ensuring that we really are contributing to achieving the sustainable development goals. Those are a few off the top of my head. Also, blending is an art and not a science. So figuring out exactly that level of catalytic capital and the types of investors to engage can be really tricky. And so Convergence is hoping to help kind of benchmark what we've seen in the market to date to build the practice.
So I see that there are dozens of questions now, so having asked for them, we've gotten ourselves into trouble in terms of, but why don't you randomly pick one more, and then I think we'll move on from there. Maybe also then, Justice, you could tell people how they might be able to get more information on your website and whatnot that might be able to answer some of those questions that they have.
Absolutely, yes. So please do not hesitate to reach out. And again, convergence.finance is our website. We have a lot of this data information that you can start to see, and then you can reach out to us if you have more specific questions. I'll try to rapid fire through a couple of these. Can you give an example of blended finance in LDCs? Yes, while the majority of blended finance has been in middle income countries, there are some great examples of blended finance in LDCs, including a bulk water supply project in Rwanda, and then as well, we've seen Central Africa SME Fund, which is a quasi-private equity fund investing in entrepreneurs in Central Africa. So those are a couple examples. To what degree does gender lens investing part of blended finance? Certainly it is a part. We're seeing blended finance start to pick up on some of the great principles established by gender lens investment. I would say that they definitely can feed off of each other. And what is the most growth in this space? Is it need driven? That's a great question. We definitely want blended finance to be needs driven. I would say the most growth we're seeing in this space right now, it's been traditionally infrastructure and financial services, which I think is a natural alignment, but we're seeing a lot more activity in the agriculture space, water and sanitation. So I think that is really needs driven, especially when we think about the agribusiness financing gap in Africa. That's great to see. We'd love to see more blended finance happening in the healthcare sector. I think that's a sector where there's a lot of potential, but we're not seeing as much activity. So that was a rapid fire. Those are all the questions I can see. I'm sure there are more that have come in elsewhere. But again, don't hesitate to reach out. We'd be happy to chat.
Thanks so much, Justice. Your presentation certainly created a lot of interest on the issue of LDC and the extent to which these are getting into the least developed countries. There is a very well-written report from the which was authored by the UNCDF and others, I think, including Convergence was a part of that. But if people would Google UNCDF and blended finance for least developed countries, you'll see a great report there that you can look at. Our next presenter is Etienne Graal. Etienne works with FinDev Canada and in fact was instrumental in launching or setting up FinDev Canada as well. Has been up and running for the last couple of years, or at least the last year. So Etienne is going to give a concrete example of what FinDev is doing relative to this space, and I just certainly welcome his contribution here. Etienne.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Justice. Thank you all for being here. This is great opportunity. Really like these kinds of opportunities to discuss directly with the great development finance community. Before I launch into a specific deal, just a few words on FinDev Canada. Jerry, yes, you're right. We are Canada's newly minted development finance institution. Our mission is to provide financial services to businesses in developing countries to achieve development outcomes. So we are, like all DFIs, at the intersection of the financial world. We're a financial institution, and the development world, because our objectives are expressed in terms of development impact. So we carry out a public policy mandate. We have been created at the initiative of the Government of Canada, but like traditionally financial institutions, in order to operate more effectively, we've been created under a Crown status. We're actually a subsidiary of Export Development Canada. But we do not have any tied elements to our mandate, just to be clear. There is sometimes ambiguity when we talk about EDC. Oh, you guys are about trade. Absolutely not. Our mandate is definitely development driven. So 18 months old, in full startup mode, and with a very limited track record still. So I need to be very modest about what I speak about today. All the credit of the deal that I'm going to speak about is really with the promoters. We are one of the participants in these deals. In these early years of our existence, partnerships are critical for us to be successful, and certainly critical to our origination strategy. A year ago, we only had 5 permanent employees, perhaps 6. So definitely partnership is key for us to get off the ground, but it will remain so. And it is definitely one of our core sort of mantra is that we want to work in partnership with others, which aligns very well with the principles of blended finance. Just 2 words on our strategies and priorities. I talked about impact, which is our core mandate. We've articulated our impact goals along 3 pillars: women's economic empowerment, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and market development, which is kind of a broad term to capture job creation, innovation, structural changes in markets. In order to achieve those objectives, and because we're fairly small, because we are very small, and with only 300 million of capital to spend at this stage, we've identified some specific sectors of regions. So in terms of sectors, agribusiness, green growth, which is everything environmental, and this is what I'll speak to in a minute, and the financial industry in developing countries. And we're focusing for the moment in about 25 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean on the one hand, and sub-Saharan Africa on the other. So that's for the introductions of who we are. So as I said, partnerships is key for us, and we have been working very closely with our fellow DFIs and other organizations in the development finance space to source our deals and structure our deals. And the Climate Investor One deal that I wanted to use as an illustration of the great intro that the Justice has made came to us through FMO, the Dutch DFI. They were one of the incubators of this initiative. So to get down into, and by the way, I only have one slide, so you don't have you'll have some time to discover the slide, and I'll walk you through it. The key thing about blended finance, and Justice framed it very well, is I like to say that blended is really a misnomer. Blended, when you put food in your blender in your kitchen, what comes out is kind of a mush, and blended finance is anything but that. It's about structure, it's about tiering, it's about organizing specific roles for specific players. So I like to use, structured finance is used by others, but I like to use the term tiered or layered finance because everyone has a very specific role to play in a structure. As Justice said, different players have different strategies, different expectations. And blended finance is not going to work if it doesn't create those opportunities for these different players to come into it. And where Climate Investor One, and why we chose this one as an illustration, is that it's a very interesting structure of blending, not just within a vehicle, but also over time. And the little diagram you see on the right-hand side here shows the three successive funds that Climate Investor One has created to cover different stages of development of any given project that they would invest in. The whole idea of blended finance is to slice risks and allocate those risks to the institutions that have the appetite for them. Early stage project development is typically not something that commercial lenders are going to go into. So that development fund which Climate Investor One has developed, which is fairly small, but it's mostly grant-based, and that's to help for the early stage project development and design, and to bring them to a stage where you can start actual construction. So this layering over time is very important. Where FinDev Canada is involved is in the middle section, which is the construction fund. So at this stage of a project, for those of you who know the space, there are still significant risks. Construction risk. It's not just about financial risk; it's the capacity of the sponsors to deliver the project and have it come online in the case of energy with the right level of production requirement. So what's interesting in the Climate Investor One structure is not only is it layered over time with three different funds for different phases of maturity, but the construction fund, which is really the core one, is layered with different types of interveners. So the tier one that was created is really to attract donor capital. So again, and that's going to come typically from government sources, to attract more catalytic funding, so players that do not expect a commercial return, to take some of the risk off through a first-loss structure to improve the risk profile of the other two tranches. And the other two tranches are different levels of commercial investors. The DFIs in this deal appear in the tier 2 and commercial banks in the tier 3. So you have a layering of the risks, and each one of these tranches has a different level of return. The higher the risk, the higher the return. That's logical in the financial world. The originality of this structure, I mean, you'll find others in the market that are somewhat similar, but the originality of this structure, within each tranche and with three separate tranches, is that creates predictability and it creates a lot of efficiencies in the process of deal development with a path to kind of commercial level financing when you get post-delivery to the refinancing fund, to offer one path to the developers. So along the lifetime of the project, developers have continuous access to capital and some predictability, even though there's not absolute automatic passage from one fund to the other. It creates that degree of simplicity that typically does not exist. Very often blended finance structures would focus on just one of these components, so the middle one, for example, and then would leave open the refinancing issue after commissioning. So that comprehensive aspects of it is very important. What's very important as well is that, and Justice was referring to the work that Convergence is doing into bringing some more understanding methodology around the parceling of the different risks. And this is critical to the success of blended finance, is that there can be a lot of negative unintended consequences if it's not done right, with over-subsidization of deals that do not necessarily need to be subsidized. What we found very compelling in the CIO offering is that they've done their homework, and they work very hard on defining those different tranches in a way that is truly reflective of the needs of the underlying projects and of the priorities and appetite of the various potential funders that they've approached. So I'm getting close to my 10 minutes here, but just to assess the benefits of this structure is truly an in-depth analysis and understanding of the underlying risks and financial requirements, coming up with a structure that we feel is not going to distort the market. So I'll leave it at that and leave it open to questions. So I see a first question here, and it was very simple, very good question, which was, can this be applied to other sectors than the renewable energy? Absolutely. As you saw, I mentioned the underlying projects very little because the key ingredients of a blended finance structure is the understanding of the needs and to divide them up into chunks and tranches that will be relevant to the various potential donors and funders. So this is a structure that would be absolutely applicable to other sectors. However, it would need to be customized to that particular sector. There's a lot of talk of billions to trillions, but we should not lose sight when we work in the private sector that we'll get to those large amounts project by project, and each one of these needs to be carefully analyzed. So there is definitely some learnings that can be drawn from CIO and applied in other sectors, but it's not a model that can be applied, boom, like this, without doing a true analysis of the underlying risks, returns, and needs of the project.
There's a couple of two more quick questions here. I'm not sure if you can see them, Etienne. One is what are the key ingredients for success, and another one which is kind of specific, but maybe you could tackle it. How do structures like Climate One relate to Canadian companies like JCM Power who are involved with renewable energy projects in the developing world?
I can answer both fairly easily. Key ingredients of success, I will never say it enough, is a really solid analysis of the underlying needs and a very solid understanding of what investors out there expect to see, whether they are development-focused investors or generic investors. As Justice said, you can invest in a blended finance structure without having a development objective because it suits your investment goals. And one of the challenges in blended finance is that we do see structures that are probably a little too hastily put together and try and fit a model to something that it's not really suited for. So I can only commend what Convergence is doing in bringing better understanding, mechanisms, tools, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where blended finance is code name for undercutting the market, because that would not be beneficial to anyone, as a matter of fact. In terms of involvement of Canadian companies, it's the two, for me, the financial structure and the underlying procurement structure are two separate things. This is a structure that could be perfectly well suited to deals in which there is Canadian involvement. As a matter of fact, we really encourage and look forward, and we have a number of conversations underway with Canadian companies to be more active in this market, whether they be operational companies. I think what was referred to as JCM Power, so a developer of power. Absolutely, we'd love to work with Canadian entities, as well as Canadian investors and donors. I think we are still, and we really look forward to the programs of Global Affairs Canada to come to market, because we see a tremendous opportunity to come up with made in Canada blended finance structures.
Well, thanks so much, Etienne. I was recently at a 2-day workshop on these same questions, so we're squeezing quite a lot into a very short period of time here, but it makes us be focused, and that's probably good. But I very much appreciate your presentation, and we're going to move over now to our final presentation. Katarina Divic. I run into, or Mita runs into, convergence and FinDev all the time at lots of different industry events, but I have not run into the Blended Finance Task Force, so I'm eager to hear a little bit more about the Blended Finance Task Force. Katarina is joining us from across the pond. Thank you for staying up a little late, or at least staying at work a little bit late, and we look forward to your presentation, Katarina.
Sure, and thank you so much for that, and thank you, Etienne and Justice, for excellent presentations as well. So I represent here today the Blended Finance Task Force, which was an initiative that was set up about 2 years ago as a daughter initiative of the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. We work with about 50 practitioners and partners from across the institutional investor community, across the development bank community, but also engage a lot with foundations and many other industry experts in this space. We have published a number of reports. One of the biggest pieces that we released was in early 2018, where we had done an extensive consultation period with a huge number of market participants and experts, where we put forward a number of recommendations around how to ideally scale the blended finance market, but really for the goal of mobilizing more capital for the sustainable development goals. In that report, we focused quite extensively on sustainable infrastructure, but we have also released a number of reports that go into other segments as well, such as sustainable land use. We do quite some work on oceans at the moment, and we've also looked into clean energy and see what we can learn from the great examples and how we can really help to replicate and scale more vehicles that can be having a great impact for the global issues that we are facing. What I'm encouraging you all to do is, as Convergence and others as well have pointed out, is please to reach out if you would like to learn more about what the task force is currently doing. At the moment, we are running an action program with 8 work streams, diving into a number of the various topics that we put forward in our consultation work that we released in 2018. We work quite extensively with our partners, seeking to help and scale and drive new initiatives and platforms while continuing to do various pieces of research work. Our website is blendedfinance.earth, so please do reach out there, but also feel free to email us directly if you have any questions or would like to get in touch. We have had the great pleasure here now today to hear from Justice then about blended finance and a great description of what it's all about. And thank you so much as well from FinDev Canada to tell us more about your work, and as well hearing more about Climate Investor One, a vehicle that we're also hugely fond of, that we think has done a lot in terms of bringing a very clever structure to the market that has been very popular as well with institutional investor uptake. As we really hope to see this structure as well being replicated to other sectors. We know that the founders have some some ambition for that, but also to see more of these type of vehicles coming ahead. So what I'm going to do in the next minutes is that on the slide ahead of you, I have put down a synthesis of some of the recent trends that we are observing, and hopefully some of this will come to fruition in the next months and years ahead. So to give you all a little bit of a sense of what we're observing in terms of recent trends, some of these are a bit broader, not fully focused, merging, and there's also a lot of fluidity actually between what we're observing of a acceleration of sustainable finance, mainstream finance, more investors coming in and wanting as well to get engaged in emerging markets, exploring how they can engage with the development finance community and vice versa. All very instrumental in terms of mobilizing more, ideally much more private capital, both from Western counterparts, but also very importantly from domestic counterparts into emerging markets. So I'm going to run through these different 10 categories. The first category, I call it digital and distributed. And this touched a little bit on as well the poll question that Justice put up previously in terms of what is the estimated infrastructure gap that we are seeing towards 2030. Because what we're observing is that with all the technology innovation and new business models that are emerging, especially due to technology and innovation, we are seeing that perhaps some of the more traditional infrastructure models may not be applicable in the future. And a number of the older estimates that have been circulating quite a lot in blended finance circles as well, highlighting the overall 6 trillion figure for infrastructure spending need every year ahead, where it's an estimated gap of 2.5 trillion, may be not necessarily the right one if we take into account, first of all the life cycle costs, but also a lot of the technology and innovation that is happening. Everything from distributed models, whether that's, for example, for off-grid solar, if we look at digitized models, if we look at shared services, which we're seeing a lot of in the automotive sector, for example, if we look at things that are happening in agriculture sector and elsewhere, it is important that the development finance community and practitioners as well are open to explore what other solutions and what technology that could be applicable for emerging markets in the years ahead, and not necessarily only encouraging proven technologies, but being willing to take some risk capital to see how one can more effectively as well support economic development in emerging markets. So we have done some research around this in a report that we called Infra 3.0, where we estimate that actually the spending requirement could be up to $1 trillion less. That doesn't mean that there's less urgency or less to be done, but it's about how can we use our funding smarter and how can we explore different models to use. I would very much encourage as well the audience to read up on a report, a huge research project that the World Bank has released recently, earlier now in 2019, called Beyond the Gap, which is also looking deeper into this overall infrastructure spending need for emerging markets, taking very importantly into account various types of technology solutions, but also looking more of a life cycle approach as well in terms of how to make sure one is budgeting enough for maintenance and things like that over the course of an infrastructure cycle. So I would very much encourage you all to look up the massive and very impressive Beyond the Gap research exercise released by the World Bank. I'm going to move now over to the next trend, which is somewhat around innovative finance products. So we have seen in the past that development banks and many in the development finance community have been very instrumental actually in terms of bringing new products to the market that have also been taking off in the mainstream and sustainable finance market. An example of that would be the green bonds market, where we saw the European Investment Bank and the World Bank and others being very early on the ones that was driving that market, which has since been scaling up into the market. We do see a number of products that are more development bank driven. We see For example, the African Development Bank have recently as well brought to market a securitization transaction that is very interesting, that basically is a synthetic securitization product, which potentially have potential to scale as well across more development banks, depending on the various constraints and needs of the different development banks. But we are seeing trends in the broader sustainable finance market to really build on what has happened, for example, with green bonds, to explore how can one link sustainability, performance to other types of credit products. So for example, there's a growing trend of sustainability-linked loans that is really looking at the performance of companies and others. My understanding is that that's not as widespread yet in the development bank and emerging market context, but we really expect to see more innovation in the types of credit lines and credit products that are coming out of the development bank market, and to really see a cross-fertilization across the sustainable finance market and for the DFIs. Another product that has been growing a lot lately, which is hugely as well driven by institutional investors, especially seeing how they can find products that can work with the current asset classes that they have, but still allow them to have access to more impact-oriented products, which is the exchange-traded funds, for example, and other index-linked funds. And we are seeing some exciting concepts that are trying to bring this as well towards developing countries, seeing how one can broaden this to not necessarily only be about climate, but also allow institutional investors to have exposure in various ways as well towards emerging markets and towards sustainable products. So we are very excited to see that hopefully there will be a further cross innovation across the development finance community and the mainstream finance community. The third trend on the slide is really focusing on the catalytic capital from the foundations and development agencies. It is fascinating to read about new initiatives and new programs that are being launched, both from governments, from development agencies, and importantly as well from the foundations. Must absolutely applaud here definitely the Canadians as well, to be exploring ways that they can use their development aid in more private sector and catalytic ways. For example, I would really encourage many that are here on the audience on the webinar today to see what one can learn from other countries that have been exploring ways to use their development aid and ODA funding catalytically in the past with guarantees. For example, you've had Sweden that have been exploring this for a number of years already, and I know they are very keen to share as well their learnings and experience with many other players too. USAID as well have been very bold in terms of how they've been trying to use guarantees as a vehicle and moving away from more traditional grant type of programs. They've been cooperating in the past, and I've heard as well that there is some even interest from the Canadian side to explore how to partner as well and learn from these institutions as well across. From the foundations as well, we're really seeing some new ways that they're trying to both get an overview of both innovative and new vehicles that are emerging. We have, for example, the MacArthur Foundation that have recently had a huge call for proposals called the Catalytic Capital Consortium. And they basically managed to get in applications for more than 100 new vehicles, for which they will not be able to provide funding to all of these vehicles. But what is fantastic is that they're planning to share a lot of learnings from that exercise, and they're also going to share a lot of learnings and information about vehicles that they also didn't end up providing financing to, but can be huge learnings. But it really shows and illustrates as well how many players are willing and wanting to explore setting up various types of blended finance vehicles. Lots of efforts and lots of private sector players as well that are eager to see how they can set up new funding solutions in order to finance the SDGs in emerging markets. So hopefully we will see even more traction among many other foundations and development agencies as well to continue to explore this.
Katarina, Just keeping an eye on the time and hoping to leave a little bit of time for some questions, because I know a lot of people are going to be interested in asking you. Is there a couple of really take-home messages that you can bring forward, and then we can do some questions?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
I can see that we're running quite out of time here. So I'll quickly move through as well. On the slide as well, I've highlighted both in point 4 and in point 10 the importance of domestic participation and the importance of cross-learnings across countries. There are very great initiatives that are appearing and also good examples to learn from, whether that is in Colombia, where they've done very innovative ways of bringing institutional investors into infrastructure. We're also seeing, for example, countries like Indonesia that are setting up their own national task forces for blended finance, working extensively with international partners, but very importantly as well, arranging huge forums where they can engage with African countries and others in order to share learnings. And this in-country ownership is something that is extremely important. And we are very pleased as well to hear that there are efforts, for example, by the Canadian pension funds that are very unique and experienced as well when it comes to infrastructure. We hear that there are initiatives where they're sharing learnings as well with pension funds in emerging markets, which is excellent to hear about. As a broad topic as well, a number of the other trends that are listed here is also about how we're seeing a scaling of vehicles that are focusing on other SDGs, whether that's focused on cities, the huge importance of engaging with the subnationals as well, and lots of new solutions coming as well for natural solutions. And we're seeing as well a lot of interest from both the finance community, everything from investment banks and others, foundations and many others, to increasingly look at sectors such as oceans and others, which is fantastic. And we will hopefully see a lot of learnings being brought over, for example, from the clean energy space to other of these sectors as well. The last slide that we have as well, where I'm highlighting some of the trends that we are observing a bit as an external view, I suppose, of how the Canadians are really leading on a number of fronts, whether that is in terms of incorporating gender, which has actually pushed so many international partners as well to take this seriously and looking at how they can incorporate gender as well in a lot of the transactions they've had. So the Canadians, I would really let you know that this has had a massive impact as well on the broader market. And there's also a lot of focus on watching closely what the Canadian pension sector, especially, and other institutional investors in Canada is doing in terms of infrastructure, and seeing how we can learn from experiences that they've had as well. So there's a question here, for example, of how we see the trends of sustainable finance trickling into developing countries, and whether we are seeing them becoming more interested in participating in blended finance. And I would say certainly yes, we do. We are seeing a massive flow of new investors that are engaging with us, but also engaging with other partners, wanting to explore and learn more about how to engage with the development finance community and seeing how they can possibly overcome some of the barriers that they may have in order to invest in emerging markets. I can see here that there's another question as well that is asking about other vehicles for natural solutions or resilient infrastructure. Two examples that I would encourage you to look into there would be, for example, the TLFF structure for Indonesia. Convergence have also released a case study on that where you can read into that vehicle more closely. We are also covering it in our Better Finance, Better World report as well. But it's a very interesting structure where they are enabling to issue a bond on the back of a underlying project to a natural rubber plantation in Indonesia, also expected to follow on with more projects on that structure. But they, on the back of a USAID guarantee, they were able to get a Moody's credit rating on the vehicle itself, and achieved to attract a lot of investors into that structure as well. So the TLFF structure, I would really suggest that you look into. On resilient infrastructure, one interesting platform would be, for example, so SDG Indonesia 1.
Thanks so much, Katarina. I'll put in a plug here that if people are, two plugs actually, I'm sure that the presenters would be open to receiving questions after, and also I'm pretty sure that CAIDP will have some sessions on this subject in their event in the fall. So maybe you could keep a note on that, keep an eye on that, and sign up for that. Just very much like to thank the presenters, Justice, Etienne, and Katarina, for your time. Marcus, you did an awesome job organizing, keeping us on the straight and narrow. Couldn't have done it without you, so thank you very much. Thanking CAIDP for making this time available and going to the effort of setting this up. And to all of you who joined us, it was a great number of people. We weren't sure exactly how many to expect, but it was a great turnout, and we appreciate everybody's time. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks again.